The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the silence of fear. He had grown used to that. The held breath before artillery. The stillness before a patrol crossed into enemy territory. This was something different. This was the silence of a place that didn't need to be loud. Feldwebel Hans Weinert stepped off the transport train at a station in rural Ontario in the autumn of 1943, squinting against the pale October light. He had been told, through the chain of rumor that moves through any army, that Canadian captivity was different, that the guards didn't scream, that the food wasn't rotten, that there were trees. He didn't believe any of it until he saw the camp. Daturbay, or rather, until he failed to see the camp. Because what faced him was not a fortress. It was not a cage wrapped in barbed wire and watchtowers and the architecture of punishment. It was a compound surrounded by open fields, modest fencing, and boreal forest stretching to a horizon that seemed to have no end. A Canadian corporal gestured toward the entrance with nothing more threatening than a pointed finger and said, in passable German, words that Weinert would later recall in a post-war memoir, "You may walk freely here." He thought it was a trick. It was not a trick. It was policy. And understanding how Canada arrived at that policy, how a nation still building its industrial identity in 1939 became the most sophisticated prisoner of war administration in the Allied world, requires understanding something deeper than logistics or law. It requires understanding a fundamental question that the Second World War forced every combatant nation to answer in its own way. What does a civilized country do with the human wreckage of industrial war? Canada's answer was unlike anyone else's. In the early months of the war, no one was thinking about prisoners. The fall of France in June 1940 was not just a military catastrophe. It was a psychological earthquake that cracked the foundations of Allied confidence and sent shockwaves through every government in the British Commonwealth. Britain stood alone. The English Channel was all that separated Churchill's embattled island from Wehrmacht divisions that had just dismantled the greatest land army in Europe in 6 weeks. In Ottawa, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King looked at his maps and understood that geography, the single most reliable friend Canada had ever had, was suddenly not enough. The Atlantic Ocean would not save anyone if Britain fell, and so Canada turned its enormous underutilized territory into an asset. The British government, desperate, overcrowded, and facing potential invasion, needed somewhere to send the growing number of German and Italian prisoners being captured across North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the occasional naval engagement. Britain's own island was too small, too vulnerable, and too psychologically raw to house thousands of enemy soldiers. Australia and South Africa were considered. But Canada was closest, had the railroad infrastructure to distribute populations across a vast interior, and possessed something no European theater country could offer: space. Unlimited, extraordinary, seemingly inexhaustible space. By mid-1940, the Canadian government had committed to hosting Allied prisoners of war on behalf of Britain. What nobody fully anticipated was the scale, the complexity, or the moral weight of what they were agreeing to manage. The first prisoners arrived not from the battlefields, but from the sea. After the fall of France, thousands of German merchant, sailors and naval personnel were captured and required immediate placement. They came in disorganized waves, exhausted, suspicious, and in many cases genuinely surprised to be alive. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police and hastily assembled military units scrambled to process men who had been told, in many cases by their own officers, that Allied captivity meant summary execution or at minimum systematic brutalization. The chaos of those early weeks nearly broke the system before it was built. Camps were improvised from fairgrounds, racetracks, and empty agricultural facilities. Guards were often older veterans of the First World War who had their own complicated relationship with German soldiers. Food supply chains hadn't been established. Medical personnel were borrowed from other departments. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which Canada had ratified, mandated minimum standards of treatment for prisoners of war. But the convention was a legal framework, not an operational manual. Translating its principles into actual practice, at scale in the middle of a war, fell to a small group of Canadian officials who were largely making it up as they went. What emerged from that improvisation was, over time, something remarkable. The man most responsible for transforming Canadian POW administration from reactive chaos into structured policy was Brigadier General Edouard de Bellefeuille-Panay, supplemented by a network of civilian administrators, military lawyers, and International Red Cross inspectors who visited camps regularly and filed scathing reports when standards fell short. But the system that eventually developed wasn't simply the product of good intentions at the top. It was built from the ground up by Canadian NCOs, camp commandants, and ordinary soldiers who applied a distinctly Canadian pragmatism to the problem. The pragmatism was this: controlling thousands of men is easier when those men are not miserable. This wasn't sentimentality. It was operational intelligence. Uprisings, escape attempts, deliberate work slowdowns, and the constant pressure of managing resentful prisoners in confined spaces. All of these cost resources, manpower, and attention that Canada needed directed elsewhere. A prisoner who had adequate food, some physical space, access to recreation, and predictable treatment was, statistically and practically, a more manageable prisoner. The Canadians arrived at this conclusion not through philosophy, but through the hard mathematics of administration. The Geneva Convention required that officer prisoners not be compelled to work. It required that food rations match those of equivalent ranks in the detaining power's own military. It required access to religious observance, correspondence with family, and protection from public curiosity and humiliation. These were minimum standards. What distinguished Canadian camps was not merely meeting those minimums, but frequently exceeding them, and doing so in ways that had cascading effects on prisoner psychology and behavior. The food, by any wartime measure, was extraordinary. Men, who had been eating the compressed, vitamin-deficient rations of the German military machine in North Africa or the Eastern Front, arrived at Canadian facilities and encountered fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and portions that left them convinced initially that it was a deliberate display, a propaganda performance to impress visiting inspectors. When the quality persisted week after week, month after month, they began to understand that this was simply what Canada fed its prisoners. Because Canada, blessed with agricultural land that stretched from southern Ontario to the prairie provinces, and insulated from the submarine warfare that was starving Britain, had food to give. One German officer, an Oberstleutnant named Friedrich Wimmer, captured in North Africa in 1943, recorded in his diary, later recovered and translated by Canadian historians, that his first Canadian meal included roasted chicken, potatoes, and a dessert he identified as apple pie. He wrote, "I have not eaten this well since my mother's table in Bavaria. I do not understand what I am seeing." The disorientation was real, and it was, in its own quiet way, a form of power. The geography of the camps themselves was a strategic decision, whether or not it was always consciously framed that way. Canada distributed its prisoner population across dozens of facilities, spread from British Columbia to Nova Scotia, but the largest concentrations were in Ontario and Quebec, where the combination of transportation infrastructure and natural containment made mass housing feasible. Natural containment meant something specific in the Canadian context: forest. Boreal forest, specifically. Dense, cold, largely roadless bush that stretched hundreds of miles in every direction from many camp locations. The camps didn't always need high fences because the landscape itself was a wall. A German soldier who escaped into the Ontario wilderness in January faced temperatures that could kill an unprepared man in hours. No road network to follow, no German-speaking civilian population to shelter him, and a country so vast that even finding a direction to run was a challenge. Several men did escape. Most were recaptured within days, frostbitten and chastened, at the edges of the nearest town saw it. Low fence, then, was not naivety. It was geography deployed as architecture. The Canadians understood that what they were building was not a cage, but a managed environment, and that the psychological effect of visible openness, the absence of the crushing, dehumanizing enclosure that defined camps in other theaters, had a measurable effect on prisoner morale and compliance. But the forest was only part of the containment. The other part was Canada itself. These men were thousands of miles from Germany, from France, from any friendly territory. The Atlantic Ocean was on one side. Thousands of miles of continental wilderness were on the other. Escape was not merely difficult. For most men, in any practical sense, it was impossible. The low fence was a statement. We do not need to imprison you with wire because the world has already done that for us. You are here and you are safe, and there is nowhere to go. That realization, settling over men slowly like the frost settling into the Canadian autumn, was its own kind of confinement. But it was a confinement without rage, without the psychological combustion of men pressed against wire who could see freedom and couldn't reach it. Among the thousands of men who passed through the Canadian system, the diversity was staggering and posed challenges that no single administrative policy could fully anticipate. The early prisoners, largely naval and Luftwaffe personnel, many of them committed National Socialists who had absorbed years of ideological formation, were among the most difficult to manage. They arrived with a particular self-concept, that they were warriors of an elite, that surrender was a temporary condition before German victory restored their freedom, that any cooperation with the enemy was tantamount to treason. Several of the most ideologically hardened officers used their authority within the camps to enforce a code of behavior on lower-ranked prisoners, monitoring correspondence, pressuring men to resist work programs, organizing demonstrations of loyalty to the Reich through singing, saluting, and deliberate defiance of Canadian regulations. This created the central tension of the Canadian POW system, one that no amount of good food or open space could fully resolve. The camps contained not one population but several, layered by rank, ideology, and experience, and those layers were frequently in conflict. The Canadians had to manage not just the relationship between guards and prisoners, but the relationships within the prisoner population itself. Junior enlisted men who might have been willing or even eager to cooperate with Canadian work programs, to do something useful with their time, earn small privileges, engage with the landscape they found genuinely extraordinary, were often prevented from doing so by senior NCOs and officers who framed cooperation as collaboration. The Geneva Convention complicated this. Under its terms, officers were entitled to separate quarters and could not be required to work. This meant that the most ideologically committed and most authoritative prisoners, the officers, were also the most difficult to manage and the least subject to the normalizing effects of productive labor. They had more time to organize, resistance, more status to enforce discipline, and more ideological investment in maintaining the fiction that German victory was imminent and that any accommodation of Canadian authority was premature. The solution, arrived at gradually and imperfectly, was physical separation. Officers were concentrated in specific facilities. Bowmanville in Ontario became the most significant officer camp, while enlisted men were distributed more widely across work camps attached to farms, forestry operations, and infrastructure projects. The separation served two purposes. It removed the most coercive authority from daily prisoner life, and it allowed enlisted men to develop an independent relationship with their captors and with the Canadian landscape that was not filtered through the politicized lens of committed National Socialist officers. The results were not uniform, but they were, on balance, remarkable. The work camps are where the Canadian story becomes something that no other Allied nation attempted at comparable scale or with comparable effect. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to perform non-military labor. Canada, with a wartime economy stretched across industrial production, agriculture, and resource extraction, had genuine labor needs. The forestry industry in particular, feeding both domestic construction and the staggering demand for war material packaging, pit props for British mines, and a dozen other applications, required workers that the domestic labor force, now largely redirected toward uniform, couldn't supply. The solution was prisoner labor, but how it was implemented in Canada differed fundamentally from how it was applied in, say, the labor camps of Germany itself, or even in the more utilitarian British system. Canadian camp commandants were instructed, partly by regulation, partly by the pragmatic culture that had evolved within the administration, to treat working prisoners as workers, not as a punishment detail. This sounds like a small distinction. It was not. A prisoner assigned to a logging crew in northern Ontario was given appropriate clothing for the season, adequate food for physical labor, rest periods, tools that were maintained and functional, and supervision that was, when it worked as intended, task-oriented rather than punitive. He was working because the work was useful, not because the work was designed to exhaust and humiliate him. The psychological effect on the men performing this work was, by every account that survives, transformative. Corporal Werner Helt, a signals technician from Saxony captured in Tunisia, spent 18 months working on a farm operation near Chatham, Ontario. In an interview conducted after the war by a Canadian journalist, he described the experience with a precision that has the ring of absolute sincerity. I was given a hoe and told to clear a section of field. The farmer, his name was McAllister, stood beside me for the first morning and showed me what he wanted. He did not shout. He spoke to me as he would speak to any hired man. When I had done a good section, he said so. When I had done a poor section, he corrected me without insult. In the evening, his wife brought food to the barn for all of us, the Canadian laborers and the prisoners together. I had been told my entire life that the English were cold and cruel. I did not find this. McAllister, in his own account, recorded in a local historical society archive, was equally measured. They worked well, those German boys. They were soldiers, you could see that. They had discipline. But they were also just men who wanted something useful to do. I never had any trouble from them. These accounts, and there are hundreds like them, represent something that doesn't fit easily into the conventional narrative of the Second World War, which is structured around hatred, atrocity, and the necessary dehumanization of the enemy. Canada, by accident and by policy in roughly equal measure, created conditions in which German soldiers experienced an alternative reality, one in which the country they had been told was decadent, weak, and worthy of conquest, was instead demonstrably decent, functional, and unexpectedly kind. This was not strategic. Canada was not running a propaganda program targeting its prisoners, but it had strategic consequences that rippled outward in ways nobody fully anticipated. The Bowmanville camp was the most complex and in many ways the most revealing episode of the entire Canadian POW administration, a pressure test that exposed both the strengths and the limits of the humane approach. Bowmanville, formerly known as Camp 30, housed the highest-ranking German prisoners in Canada, senior Luftwaffe officers, naval commanders, and a population that included some of the most decorated and most ideologically committed members of the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were men who had commanded U-boats that had killed Allied sailors. They were Jagdpiloten who had fought over Britain. They were officers who had been present at the occupation of France, Yugoslavia, Greece. They carried themselves with a military bearing and an ideological certainty that they maintained, with considerable energy, as a form of resistance. The camp commandant in the critical period of 1942 was Lieutenant Colonel Bull, who inherited a facility that had developed an internal culture of organized resistance to Canadian authority. The prisoners had established their own hierarchy, their own courts of discipline for infractions against prisoner solidarity, and their own intelligence network for gathering information about the outside world. They interpreted the relative openness of the camp not as Canadian generosity, but as Canadian weakness. The crisis came in October 1942 and was triggered by a decision made not in Ottawa, but in London and Berlin simultaneously. A catastrophic diplomatic escalation involving the treatment of prisoners taken at Dieppe. The Dieppe raid of August 1942 had been a disaster of the first order, and the majority of the nearly 2,000 Canadians captured during the operation were, by documented, German order, shackled as prisoners of war, a direct and deliberate violation of the Geneva Convention. The pretext offered by the German government was that documents recovered from the raiders contained orders to bind captured Germans during the operation. Britain and Canada, outraged, responded by ordering the shackling of German prisoners in Canada in reciprocal retaliation. The order arrived at Bowmanville on October 10, 1942. The reaction was immediate and violent. The prisoners, senior officers who had maintained their dignity partly through the physical freedom the camp allowed, refused. They barricaded sections of the camp, armed themselves with chair legs and improvised clubs, and when Canadian soldiers attempted to implement the shackling order, fought back in a melee that lasted hours. The Battle of Bowmanville, as it came to be called in Canadian military records, was not a dramatic prison break or a siege. It was a sustained physical confrontation between Canadian guards and German officers who had decided that this particular order represented a line they would not cross. The Canadians won in the sense that order was eventually restored. They lost in the sense that the shackling policy was abandoned within months on both sides, the entire episode having demonstrated only that reciprocal degradation resolved nothing and cost everyone. The Red Cross condemned both governments. The shackles were quietly removed. The prisoners returned to their relatively open confinement. But the Battle of Bowmanville had revealed something important about the psychology of the German officer-prisoners that would shape Canadian policy. Going forward, these men were not broken. They were not demoralized. They were intensely proud, genuinely committed, and capable of organized violence when they believed their honor was at stake. Managing them required something other than the relatively straightforward approach that worked with enlisted men doing farm labor in rural Ontario. It required a kind of management that was simultaneously firm and, where possible, respectful of the prisoner's own self-concept. A difficult balance, but one that the Canadians pursued with more consistency than almost any other Allied administration. The question of ideology ran through the entire Canadian prisoner experience like a fault line, and nowhere was it more visible than in the re-education programs that Canada, quietly and without great fanfare, began implementing in the later years of the war. By 1943, it was becoming apparent to anyone who had studied the prisoner population carefully, the camp commandants, the psychological advisors attached to the system, the Red Cross observers, that the German prisoner population was not monolithic. It contained committed National Socialists who would defend the regime under any circumstances. It contained professional soldiers who had served from duty and military culture rather than ideology, men who had fought because they were soldiers, not because they were believers. And it contained a third group, younger, less certain, frequently from lower-class backgrounds that had benefited materially from Nazi economic policy, and therefore had complicated relationships with both the regime and their current situation, who were genuinely uncertain what they thought. This third group was the opening. The Canadian approach to ideological management was not the systematic, formally structured re-education that the Americans would eventually implement in their own prisoner camps under the intellectual diversion program. It was more organic, more accidental, and in some ways more effective for being so. It happened through proximity, through labor, through the visible functioning of a democratic, multi-ethnic country that didn't behave anything like the caricature that National Socialist propaganda had constructed. Consider what a German prisoner in Canada in 1943 actually observed on a daily basis. He saw a country that was simultaneously British, French, Indigenous, immigrant, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, and that was, by any measure he could apply, functioning. He saw black Canadian soldiers in uniform, respected by their peers, and by the civilian population in ways that contradicted everything he had been told about the inherent hierarchies of race. He saw women in factories and on farms, doing the work of men without the social collapse that Nazi ideology predicted. As the inevitable consequence of abandoning gender hierarchy, he saw a free press that criticized the government without anyone being arrested. He saw, in short, democracy working. Not perfectly. Canada had its own injustices, its own shadows, its own contradictions. But working, the Red Cross reports from Canadian camps in 1943 and 1944 consistently noted that prisoner morale, while initially high among ideologically committed prisoners, showed a measurable decline over time that correlated not with harsh treatment, but with the prolonged exposure to the reality of Canadian society. Men who had believed with genuine conviction that the Anglo-American world was in terminal decline, decadent and weak, and ready to fall before German power. These men were confronted month after month with evidence to the contrary. It didn't convert all of them. It didn't convert most of them, not openly, not in ways they would acknowledge. But it planted questions. And questions, in the soil of prolonged captivity with nothing but time to think, grow. There was a musical dimension to the Canadian camps. That sounds almost absurd in the context of total war. And yet it documented itself so thoroughly in prisoner memoirs, Canadian military records, and post-war interviews that it cannot be dismissed. The Canadians allowed, and in some cases, actively facilitated, prisoner theater, orchestral performance, and choir groups. Instruments were provided, or prisoners were allowed to construct them. A full orchestra functioned at Gravenhurst Camp in Ontario, performing works by Beethoven, Brahms, and Wagner for audiences that included both prisoners and, on at least several occasions, Canadian civilian visitors who came out of curiosity and left in complicated emotional states, having watched German prisoners performing German music with technical excellence in the middle of the Ontario wilderness. The reasoning, from the Canadian administrative perspective, was straightforward. Occupied men were less dangerous. Men who were rehearsing Schumann didn't have the mental bandwidth to be planning escapes or organizing internal intimidation campaigns. Culture was a management tool. It was also, incidentally, a humane recognition that these were men and not simply problems. But the effect went beyond management. The men who participated in cultural programs, the musicians, the actors, the painters who were given materials and allowed to work, emerged from the experience having spent years in sustained creative engagement rather than sustained resentment. Several became, after the war, advocates for German-Canadian reconciliation. Some returned to Canada as immigrants. At least one German prisoner who had played violin in the Gravenhurst Orchestra returned to Ontario decades later and left flowers at the site of the camp, which by then had been demolished. That is a small thing, measured against the scale of what the war cost. But it is not nothing. The camps were not always peaceful. The Canadians were not always correct. The system had failures, moments of genuine cruelty, incidents of guard abuse that were recorded, investigated with varying degrees of thoroughness, and sometimes not adequately addressed. Some of the most ardent National Socialists in the officer camps used the internal prisoner hierarchy to punish men who they believed were cooperating too willingly with their captors. There were beatings, psychological campaigns of intimidation, and at least one documented death that Canadian authorities suspected was an internal execution disguised as an accident. The Canadian response to these internal prisoner politics was perpetually inadequate. The Geneva Convention's protections of prisoner hierarchy, specifically the provision that prisoners were entitled to their own chain of command within the camp, meant that Canadian authorities had limited legal standing to intervene in what prisoners did to each other, provided it wasn't happening in full view of the guards. The most committed ideologues used this protection as a shield, and some of the most vulnerable prisoners, men who had expressed doubts, men who had cooperated with Canadian authorities, men who came from backgrounds that made them suspect, in the eyes of committed National Socialists, paid a price for it. This was the deepest structural failure of the Humane approach. It created an environment that was genuinely better for most prisoners, but that could not fully protect the most vulnerable prisoners from the violence of their own hierarchy. The openness and the cultural latitude that made Canadian camps remarkable also gave ideological hardliners room to operate. It is a sobering qualification, and it sits beside the more frequently told story of Canadian decency, not as a contradiction, but as a complexity, the kind of complexity that honest history requires. By the autumn of 1944, with the war in Europe clearly moving toward Allied victory, the character of the prisoner population began to shift in ways that changed the texture of the camps entirely. The men arriving now were not the confident, ideologically armored soldiers of 1940 and 1941. They were younger. Many were teenagers, pressed into service by a Wehrmacht, scraping the bottom of its demographic reserves. They arrived malnourished, disoriented, and in many cases genuinely relieved to be out of the war. They had not been formed by years of Nazi ideological education in the way their predecessors had been. They were, simply, frightened boys who wanted to be warm. The contrast with the early prisoners was stark enough that camp commandants noted it explicitly in their reports. The same facilities that had once housed prisoners who needed to be watched for organized resistance were now receiving young men, who needed to be watched because they wept at night and didn't know what their country had done. The political re-education that Canada had never formally systematized now became more explicitly necessary, and more explicitly urgent. With the liberation of the concentration camps beginning in early 1945, with the photographic evidence of industrial genocide circulating through Allied command, the question of what to tell German prisoners, and how and when, became acute. The Canadians, working in coordination with British and American authorities, began showing prisoners the photographic documentation of the camps, the newsreel footage, the testimony of survivors. The reactions varied in ways that map almost exactly onto the divisions that had always existed within the prisoner population. The committed ideologues denied it, dismissed it as propaganda, invented counter-narratives. The professional soldiers absorbed it in stunned silence and refused to discuss what they thought. The young men, the frightened teenagers who had arrived in late 1944 and early 1945, often wept. One Canadian officer, Captain David Galloway, recorded in his personal diary his experience of showing this material to a group of younger prisoners. At a camp near Kingston, Ontario in June 1945, I had expected denial. I had steeled myself for the arrogance I had seen from the older ones. What I found instead was a room full of boys who looked as though the floor had been taken away from under them. One of them, perhaps 17 years old, blonde, the kind of face you see in church choir photographs, put his head on the table and did not lift it for the rest of the session. I did not know whether to feel vindicated or devastated. That ambivalence, feeling vindicated and devastated simultaneously, was the emotional signature of Canada's entire relationship with its prisoners. It was a program that worked, and working meant confronting the full moral weight of what had been done, which was not clean or simple or uncomplicated. The repatriation, when it came, was not a moment of uncomplicated celebration. After VE Day, in May 1945, the process of returning German prisoners to their country of origin began, but it did not happen quickly. the destroyed infrastructure of post-war Germany, the enormous displaced persons crisis, the occupation zones being sorted out between the Allied powers, the logistical challenge of moving hundreds of thousands of men across an Atlantic that was still recovering from years of submarine warfare. All of these factors meant that many German prisoners remained in Canada well into 1946 and some into 1947. These final months in the camps had their own character. The ideological pressure had largely collapsed. The war was over. National Socialism was defeated, demonstrably and completely. Many of the most committed holdouts, men who had maintained, with extraordinary persistence, that Germany would ultimately prevail, now faced a psychological reckoning that had no precedent in their experience. The world they had believed in had been dismantled by history, and the world they were living in, the Canadian camps, the Ontario farms, the northern forests, the modest spaces of ordered, civilized life in a country that had treated them, by the standards of the time and the standards of what they knew, extraordinarily well, remained. Some men didn't want to leave. This is documented. There are records of prisoners petitioning to remain in Canada, to immigrate, to build lives in the country that had held them. Some were successful. German immigrants from the prisoner population, or from families of former prisoners, contributed to the post-war Canadian economy, particularly in construction, agriculture, and skilled trades. The Kitchener-Waterloo region of Ontario, already home to significant German-Canadian populations from earlier immigration waves, absorbed some of these men. They built houses, opened businesses, married Canadian women, and raised children who were Canadian without qualification. The country that had imprisoned them became the country they chose. That is not a small statement about what kind of prison Canada had built. The strategic significance of the Canadian POW system is not always recognized in the broader literature of the Second World War, which tends to focus on battles, campaigns, and the movements of armies. But what Canada did with its prisoner population had consequences that extended well beyond the administrative sphere. The Geneva Convention compliance that Canada maintained, imperfect but consistent, documented and defended, contributed materially to the willingness of German forces on the Western Front to surrender to Allied rather than Soviet forces as the war entered its final months. Word moved, as it always does in armies, through the informal networks of men who had returned, however briefly, to German military custody after being repatriated due to medical condition, through letters home that had passed Canadian censorship, and arrived in German households, through the simple accumulation of testimony. German soldiers who contemplated surrender knew, by 1944 and 1945, that Canadian captivity meant survival and decent treatment. This knowledge shaped decisions in ways that are impossible to quantify precisely, but that certainly saved lives on both sides of the front. There is also the longer strategic legacy of Canadian humanitarianism in captivity, the way it positioned Canada in the post-war settlement as a nation that had discharged one of the most difficult obligations of war with something approaching honor. Canada did not have Nuremberg-level atrocities to answer for. Canada did not have mass graves of prisoners. Canada had apple pie and orchestras and Ontario farms, and the testimony of thousands of men who had been treated, within the constraints of confinement, as human beings. This is, in the cold calculation of international standing, worth something considerable. Nations are remembered not only for their victories, but for their conduct. Canada's conduct in this particular dimension of the war was, by any fair measure, extraordinary. There is a photograph, black and white, slightly blurred, taken by an unknown photographer at an unknown camp in Ontario sometime in 1944, that appears in several archives and in the collections of at least 2 Canadian universities. In it, a group of German prisoners and Canadian guards are seated around a long table eating. The food on the table is abundant by the standards of 1944. The men on both sides of the national divide are, if not relaxed, then at least engaged in the shared human ritual of the meal. Nobody is looking at the camera. Nobody seems to be performing for it. What makes the photograph remarkable is its ordinariness. It looks like nothing so much as a church hall dinner, or a harvest supper, or any one of 10,000 communal meals in the life of any rural Canadian community. The war, with its ideologies and its death counts and its political architectures, is invisible in the image. What is visible is simply people, eating, in a place that appears, however briefly, to be at peace. That photograph is, in some ways, the whole argument. Hans Weinert, the Feldwebel who stepped off the train in Ontario in the autumn of 1943 and failed to find the cage he expected, survived the war, was repatriated to West Germany in 1946, and spent 40 years as a school administrator in a small town near Stuttgart. In the late 1970s, a German documentary filmmaker tracked him down while producing a film about the experiences of German POWs in Allied captivity. The filmmaker asked him, toward the end of a long interview, whether he had understood, at the time, what Canada was doing by treating him the way it did. Weinert thought about the question for a long time. Then he said, "I thought it was a weakness. A country that cannot imprison its enemies properly must be a soft country. An innocent country. I thought, we will win this war, and this soft place will be easy. Then I was there for 2 years, and I understood that I had it entirely backwards. The softness was the strength. The openness was the confidence. They did not need to cage us because they were not afraid of us. And a country that is not afraid of its prisoners is a country that knows something about itself that we had forgotten. To know about ourselves." He paused. "I have thought about that for 40 years. I still think about it. Canada entered the Second World War as a country still discovering the full scale of its own capacity. Not certain. Not fully formed. Not yet. Aware of how much it could bear and still remain itself. It emerged from that war having fought at Dieppe and Juno Beach, and through the Scheldt estuary, having built the ships and the aircraft and the industrial muscle that the Allied cause required, having done all of the things that armies are asked to do, and that cost more than anyone expected. And it had done this other thing, this quieter thing, this thing that is harder to represent on a monument or commemorate with a parade. It had taken the human wreckage of the war, the defeated, the disoriented, the dangerous, and the merely frightened, and treated them with a consistency of decency that no international tribunal required and no military calculus fully explained. It had done it because the people who built the system believed, whether they articulated it this way or not, that how a country behaves when it has absolute power over the powerless is the truest measure of what that country is. By that measure, Canada performed remarkably. The low fences of the Ontario camps were not a sign that Canada didn't understand the stakes of the war it was fighting. They were a sign that Canada understood something larger, something about what it was building, what it wanted to be, what kind of country would be standing when the noise and the dying finally stopped. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The camps were dismantled. The fields returned to agriculture. The forests returned to silence. The orchestras stopped playing. The apple trees grew old, but the men who had walked freely through those compounds carried something home with them across the Atlantic, something they had not expected to find in the middle of a world war, in a country most of them had never thought about before a ship or a transport plane had brought them there. They carried the knowledge that a cage can be built without walls, and that the most powerful thing a country can say to its enemy, the thing that takes the most confidence, the most self-possession, the most genuine strength, is simply this: you may walk freely here.